You're listening to another episode of Rig Recon Live. I'm Bruce Quick alongside Jason Whitmire. And before we get started on today's episode and topic, I wanted to remind you to follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook. That's at Rig Recon. You can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including you can watch it on YouTube. Make sure you hit those post notification buttons so you know when all the episodes come out and all of our posts come out. And then finally, visit rigrecon.com for all the latest apparatus information. And when you're going to make your next spec, this is the place you want to go. Even if you're looking to upgrade or retrofit an existing rig, which we just did a podcast on this week about that as well. So one-stop shop for everything, but I won't take too much time from that. So we're joined by Eric Wheaton today. And Eric, I won't do justice in introducing you, so I'll let you take it away from here.
Yeah. My name's Eric Wheaton. I'm a 18-year battalion chief with the city of Winter Park down in sunny Florida, just right outside the city of Orlando. Second generation firefighter there. My father retired in 2016 with 31 years, as well as my father-in-law, 36 years he did there. So I like to joke and say that I married a battalion chief's daughter, but I guess in the end it all worked out well for me. And yeah, I'm the owner of Inner Search LLC. It's a training company that we travel around the country doing several classes, predominantly truck company related topics, including aerial operations, which is a lot of what we're going to get into today. But yeah, that keeps me busy. I'm full-time firefighter and full-time business owner, and got a busy year, or had a busy year, and ending this year pretty busy. In 2026 are already stacking up big time for us. So I'm actually leaving to go to Reno here in about a week. So
Awesome.
yep.
Thanks for joining us today, Eric. Today's focus is going to be on aerial apparatus and the operations and the setup of them. We're going to debate a few things. So we're going to kind of get into the subject of mid mount versus rear mount. They're two very different animals in this industry. They operate different. You set them up on scene different. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about a little bit of platform versus straight stick. And we kind of broke it into two subjects because even though first we do mid mount and rear mount, that platform is going to differ whether it's mid mount or rear mount, and that straight stick's going to differ. So we'll break them apart and then we'll kind of bring them back together in the end. So just to keep everyone on task and keep us separated a little bit, let's start with mid mount versus rear mount, and let's just go over the general aerial size, like what kind of length do you get? What kind of reach do you get? And what are the considerations between why you might want a rear mount versus a mid mount?
Yeah. So, and when I talk to spec committees, whether it be through my own department or through my travels and a little bit of consulting that we're doing, obviously that's a big topic. Do we go with rear mount? Do we go with mid mount? And basically the question always goes back on the department and, kind of what's your response district like? So that's the first thing I would look at. Because realize if you're going with a rear mount, your ride height's going to be much higher. So, for instance, for our city, we have a very low tree canopy. In Central Florida, there's a lot of oak trees. And from us going from a rear mount to a mid mount, we lost about 1.5 feet of ride height on our current spec. So, if you have low bridges in the area or anything like that, that's ride height is something to think about, because with a rear mount, the aerial device, whether it be a bucket or a stick, is going to be over the cab. The other thing is response model, like how your apparatus arrives to a fire, is another thing that we would look at. And give it a perfect example of this is if your engine companies are typically showing up first due to the fires, and you're a cross-lay department, and that driver likes to line that cross-lay up with that front door, and you have a mid-mount and the truck pulls in behind that engine company, that now put the turntable, a house or two down the block, rather than being up close and closer to the scene. Whereas if you still have that response model and you really can't convince your engine drivers to pull past the building, a mid mount would get that aerial device just that much closer to the fire building. And then another thing that we would look at is compartmentalization. You're going to get a significant amount of compartment capacity increased with a rear mount, being that the aerial again has to sit above the cab, meaning that we can go with the high sided compartments. And then the opposite, if you're running a mid mount, that's going to sit below and behind the cab, and that's going to chew away some of your compartment space. So again, to reference my fire department, we ultimately opted with a tiller truck, which obviously compartment space is going to kind of blow every apparatus out of the water on that. But when we were in when we went from originally from a mid mount to a rear mount, we increased our compartment space tenfold, and that's because we're the only truck in the city. I like to say we're the only new truck, and we're also the only special operations in the city. So we opt for more compartment space to be able to handle all the special operations equipment. And so it's kind of always when you're designing apparatus, there's a give or take to anything, but those are kind of three big components that we look at when we're talking about specing an apparatus and when it comes to mid mount versus rear mount.
Every podcast we have, we get into the fact that when you want to gain something somewhere, you're going to give something else up. So that's a great point. And I love the fact that you touched on, it's not just about where the stick is and how you're going to operate. The compartmentation is going to change. That, I think that's a huge point, that it kind of depends on your department and what your needs are.
Absolutely. And then, the other thing kind of tuck on too would be the drivability of the vehicle. Again, if you have that rear mount, you got what's called a bucket sticking off the front of the cab. That's a very difficult thing to maneuver around a tight city. You're making a left turn and you have the street signs on that off corner. That's something that the driver operator is going to have to look at. I mean, just sitting at a red light can be an inconvenience because you have a ladder tip or buckets over the back end. Now, a rear mount, a mid mount, that tends to extend the tail end of these vehicles. So you kind of have an opposite effect, right? Where now a lot of the bad things can happen when you maneuver in this vehicle around the cities off to the back end of the hardest spot to see on the truck. And it takes a very experienced driver and trained driver to know to go deep and wide in these turns to avoid what we would call can opener, the parallel parked cars, which is obviously not a good thing.
No, and let's talk about tip load rating. So, do you see differences in the available tip load between the two designs?
Um, and I'll preface any of this conversation, really, I should started with this too, is, anytime that I'm, kind of consulting or talking about training, it is within my own experience and, the experience, whether it be on the job or what I get to operate with other departments and see their manufacturers and their different specs. And me personally, I have not seen a huge difference in mid mount versus rear mount, and where we're at in Florida, especially where I deal with a lot of the departments down here, in tip load rating. Where we're going to see a significant difference in tip load rating would be the conversation of bucket versus stick. That's where we'll get some of that tip load. And I know in the Northeast they're using a lot of aeroscopes and things, and that's like a true tower ladder there. I know those things have a significant amount of tip load rating, being that they're basically a crane. In Florida, we actually don't get a lot of departments, really any departments down here that have those type of apparatus.
I've got a funny story on tip load, and I won't throw the customer under the bus, but back in the day when I was doing aerial design, I was out on a sales call and I said, well, the tip load on that aerial you're looking at, it was one of our competitors, is only 250 pounds. And there aren't a whole lot of 250-pound firefighters once you put that gear and air pack on. And the guy looked at me and said, you're lying. I said, what do you mean? It's 250 pounds. He said, no, it has a 2.5 to 1 safety factor. So it's actually like 600 plus pounds. Sorry, Chief, that's not the way it works. Well, let's please not go that route.
Yeah, please don't do that.
So when we do get into mid mount versus rear mount, you already spoke a little bit about placement on the seat. So it's going to change where you position that rig, but it's also going to change your operational envelope a little bit. So ideally, we want to get around 360 degrees so that we can put that aerial anywhere based on where we park it. And there are situations where you need to go below grade. There are situations where you need to maybe go off the front of the cab. Talk about some of the challenges you get into between the two different designs there.
Yeah, no, all great points. I'll hit over the cab first of all. The cab of any aerial device rig is going, no matter if it's rear mount or mid mount, is going to be its biggest obstruction. Why I'm a huge fan of flat roofs on aerial devices. If you're a department that's got, you got to have a raised roof on every apparatus. All I just say is please save those for the engine companies, but keep your flat roofs on the aerial devices. Working over the front of the cab, just how the angles work out, the mid mount is even more significant because the turntable is just right there behind the cab. And how angles work, you're not going to be able to really work over the cab really at all at a low angle. The rear mounts, you'll be able to get a little bit lower because you basically can stay at a 0 degree angle because, again, the aerial is right over the cab, but still not ideal. The best positioning on both apparatus is to get the cab turned out of the way or turned into the building, just depending on your aerial reach. As far as working below grade, your mid mounts are going to be your bread and butter for that. They're typically, not only is the turntable sitting several feet lower when it just is stationary, it is able to go work off the side of the truck and get to a negative angle. And there's tons of incidents where working below grade can be very beneficial, whether it be a special operations call or something completely out of the box from the fire scene, and you have to work down a ravine to rescue somebody out of a swift water situation. And really where the buckets, and especially a mid-mount bucket's really going to get their worth is during master stream operations. A mid-mount bucket truck for master stream operations that is about as best and premier as you're going to get when it comes to any type of apparatus. The other thing too, mid-mount and versus rear mount, is the bedded length. Typically a bedded length on a mid-mount is going to be much shorter. It's why you see a lot of urban cities or small, tight, congested cities opt for a mid-mount for their bedded length of their aerial going to be much smaller. So if you work with a department that's got a lot or very short setback from street to alpha side, you're going to want that more compact bedded length, so you're able to get the truck out of the cradle, rotate 90 degrees off the side, and not hit the building. So with a rear mount, that is going to be extended past the cab of the truck, so its bedded length is going to be much longer as well.
So now we're talking from an operational standpoint with that longer bedded length. I've got to raise that aerial straight up in the air basically to rotate it around so I don't hit things.
Correct. And again, getting back to the low grade operations, that's that much more setback you're going to have to get that tip towards the bottom of towards the ground. So you have to have enough room to position away. And that's why when we're teaching our class, we talk about moving that turntable as an operator. When you go into to position the rig, do you want to push the turntable closer to the building because you have a long setback? Or do you have a very short setback, basically a planer box and a sidewalk, whereas now we're going to have to pull the turntable away from the building to be able to get to those lower levels of the building if needed.
Well, a lot of times when we talk about below grade operations, people think about things like a rescue, or if I've got a platform and I've got it up and I've got a victim in there, now I can put it on the ground to get that victim out. One of the other places that we see in the industry some below grade operations, and I'm just curious if you've ever done it, is a storefront blitz.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's what I was kind of leaning towards. That is like, to me, if I was going to get a bucket truck that's a mid-mount, I'm really going to spec it heavily to optimize in that specific operation. The platforms, especially a platform, down low towards the ground on the sidewalk, directing that stream up into the ceiling space is very optimal. And in fact, we do several drills with that, where if we have the opportunity to train in a vacant building or a local fire academy, we will shoot the stream either on floor one and run the underside of the decking or the ceiling. And then for upper floor, same thing. We'll shoot it through a window and run the underside of decking, roof decking, or the ceiling as well. And you can see the water mapping. You can see the water just skate across the ceiling, hit the back wall, and rain down. Really good for attic fires. And there's even ways to manipulate the aerial device to do that too. It's not just for a bucket, although bucket's really set up to do that a lot more optimal.
So something really important for our audience to note, a lot of what we're talking about here is a platform with that storefront blitz. And like Eric just mentioned, you can do it with the straight stick, but not every straight stick can do it, and not every monitor can do it. So if that's something you want in your arsenal and you want to be able to put that aerial straight down below grade and then move your nozzle up, to spray into that front storefront. Make sure you've specified that. Otherwise, your deck gun or your ladder pipe might not be able to do that.
Yeah, and so people understand what happens is on a pre-plumbed aerial device, a ladder, your monitor is under the rungs, right? So the monitor is not going to allow you to go above a 0-degree angle, basically, because you would just basically hit the rungs. The nozzle tips would hit the rung, the water stream would hit the rungs, and so again, you need to talk with your apparatus manufacturer and see if there's a monitor or a way they can push that monitor out beyond that last rung to be able to do that technique.
Yeah, and I think we did a great job covering operations and how that style may change. One thing that you also talked about, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it, is the compartments, right? So, based on the different designs, really talk about the restrictions that you get in the compartments of that rig.
So, again, your rear mounts are going to afford you a lot more compartment space. So you see a lot of suburban departments or departments that have maybe 1 or 2 trucks in their arsenal to go with a rear mount just solely off compartment space. A lot of quint style departments are going with a rear mount again because they have to carry engine equipment, they have to carry ladder equipment, and sometimes they even carry small special ops equipment, whether it be a full round of cribbing and hydraulic tools. It's typically a very suburban quint style cache of tools. You're going to have to go with the rear mount, and with the rear mount, you're going to typically get at least 1 or 2 traverse compartments. Excuse me. So that way, you can get these huge slide out shelves that can pull out in any direction, and you have a heck of a lot more compartment space in that sense. For the departments where compartment space isn't necessarily the top of their priority list because they operate more as a dedicated truck company and ladder company only, you'll get minimum compartment space, but what you can do is get more ground ladder space. And again, anytime you add more ground ladders, that just takes away from compartment space. But again, typically departments that have multiple trucks in their arsenal, urban departments, those are going to be your very traditional truck companies, and they're going to opt for the mid mounts to have that shorter bed length so they can operate their tighter streets. And also their equipment that they're carrying are more truck company related stuff. So forceful entry tools, some saws, maybe a salvage compartment, and then portable ladders. And that's basically it. And so, yeah, I mean, that's something that you really need to go at first thing in your mind is compartment space, because there's a significant difference between the two.
Awesome. Great input. We're going to shift gears now. We've covered most of the stuff on mid-mount versus rear mount. I'm sure there's more that we could cover, but in the interest of time, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk a little bit about ladder versus bucket. So when we say ladder, we're talking about a straight stick here that has nothing on the end of it. It could have a nozzle, of course, but no platform on the end of it. When we talk bucket, there's a lot of terms out there for it. Heard it called a bucket, heard it called a platform. I've heard some people call it an elevated dumpster, whatever you want to call it.
I like that.
It's a platform at the end that people are going to be in. Let's start with weight. Obviously, that platform has a weight associated to it. So that's going to take away some of my tip load. But let's just talk about some of the considerations with weight, not just with what the platform adds, because that may be more of an OEM question, like how much does the platform itself weigh? But let's talk about all the little things they want to put in there now because it's a platform.
Yeah, I mean, you can go fully custom in some of these platforms. I mean, I've seen anything from breathing air and all the attachments that come with that, hose rolls, forceful entry tools, piercing nozzles, dual monitors, minimal rope equipment. I've seen that. Some people keep their parapet ladder brackets up there, and realize when you spec all that stuff on, the bucket comes out of the factory with a tip load rating. And traditionally, again, this has been my experience, you're looking around that 1,000-pound tip load is a very traditional bucket truck tip load. And so if you go and you add, say, 400 pounds of gear and equipment on there, you've now eat into that 1,000-pound tip load. And you also take up a lot of room for the firefighters. Through talking with me, you're probably gonna see that I'm more a traditionalist. I like a pretty clean bucket or pretty clean aerial tip to make it more effective and efficient for the operators that are in there. But I do realize that there are a lot of departments that like to put every bell and whistle on there. And, like I mentioned, the bucket trucks are typically that 1,000-pound tip load, and a very traditional tip load of an aerial device is going to be around that 500 pounds. It does drop to 250 and it goes up to 750. Those are some other common numbers, but usually 500 and 1,000 are your pretty quick generalization of tip loads between the two.
And let's talk maybe about drivability, and we talked about it, right? Whether that bucket's either gonna be on the front with an overhang or on the back, and like you alluded to, if it's on the front, it could be hard to see the street lights. If it's on the back, you might be scraping the parked cars. So maybe dive deeper into that and sort of how it, differs compared on what roads you're driving on.
Yeah, I may give you a personal example that happened to us. We had our rear mount bucket truck, and this would have been in 2010. And one of our drivers basically literally drove the aerial device into an oak tree, and so much so that it lifted the aerial out of the cradle several inches, and it took us about an hour or so to cut it out of the tree. Did about 30 back then. Did about $33,000 worth of damage. Um, but yeah, it's a very tough. A bucket truck is it's a lot of responsibility on an operator just to drive it around town. Again, if it's hanging off the front, you got not, that still has tail swing, not as much, but it does have tail swing, but you have that front swing. It's harder to see trees that are low hanging branches coming at your eyebrow level. It's hard to even see street lights or street signs when you're making turns. And if it's hanging off the back of the truck, that's, 40, 50 feet behind you. That's very difficult to see when you're swinging the thing around, and it's going to add length there. And I know some manufacturers will squeeze in that wheelbase to make it tighter turning. However, by doing that, that basically creates a bit of a more tail swing. And so, yeah, as an operator, driving a buck around, it's pretty tough. The air devices are going to be a lot more sleek. They're a lot more slim. They can fit into tighter places. Driving them around town wise, whether it be off the front or the back. Typically, your mid mount sticks, which is a very uncommon setup, but your mid mount sticks, if they hang off the back of the truck, it's very minimal, only by a few feet in my experience that I've seen. And it's going to sit high. It's going to sit on top of the back of the truck, right? So you're not, so worried about sideswiping cars in that case, even though that tip does have to swing out. And if it's mounted on the front, if it protrudes off the front of the cab, again, it's only about 3 or so feet, and it's a little easier to navigate. Where I've seen a huge difference between the two in tight, districts that run a lot of oak trees like we do, that's basically my experience, is trying to punch the bucket or the stick when we're flying it through those trees to get to our objective. There's a lot of areas that we cannot push a bucket through because of the branches of an oak tree, but I can take that same position on an aerial device now, and I can stab that aerial through those light branches to get to my objective if needed. So there's kind of a pro in the side of an aerial device if you're working with a lot of tree coverage.
Great suggestions on, or great tips on how they operate and what you need to look at and things like that. One of the things that we really dive into at Elkhart Brass, which is part of our family of products, would be the monitor. So when we start talking about the monitor and flow limitations and dual monitor versus single monitor, smoothbore versus a fog nozzle, can you give some of your opinions and experience with the different setups there?
Yeah. With the dual monitor thing, one of my kind of cons with that is, depending on the manufacturer, if you have a dual monitor, it potentially blocks your access doors. How the nozzles are stored, they're stored in a position. If you have a manufacturer that puts their access doors in and out of the bucket in the front, you now have a trip hazard or something you have to step over to get in and out of that basket. So for that reason alone, I'm not a big fan of it if you're stuck on a certain manufacturer. Now, the department or the manufacturers that move their doors to the corners, it's not as drastic, but it is still a potential for a hang up there. The other thing that we found when dealing with departments that had a dual monitor, our department has never had that. When we did have the bucket, it was only single monitor, but just having the water capacity to even flow 2 monitors at a time. If you got a great hydrant system and it can flow to that capacity, sure. For us, we weren't able to do that for the neighboring departments that would come in and train with us. Our hydrants would never have that flow capacity. So for us, sticking with that single monitor was more beneficial for us. The other thing with the aerial device too, when we talk about flow rates, again, very broad statement here, or generalization statement, I should say, is what we found in our area. Bucket trucks are usually maxing out at 2,000 GPM, and our ladders are around 1,000 GPM. And even with our 1,000 GPM aerial, sometimes we can't even, have hydrants that can fully pump that.
Well, people need to keep in mind that some of that rating and some of that restriction, obviously there's friction loss in the plumbing. It's a tight setup there, but it comes into, even if you could get the water out of it, sometimes it's the reaction force that's putting into that aerial device. So the aerial, maybe you could physically over pump it and get it up to 1,250, but it might only be rated for 1,000 gallons per minute because you're putting bad stress on that aerial device when you get to that 1,250 rating. You have to keep that in mind when you're doing a design.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you're like short jacking your rig, the nozzle reaction that can go to that short jack side, I mean, that comes into play. And just every angle is just changing the forces on that ladder. How much your ladder is extended or retracted, that all is going to play into the forces and the mechanical advantage you're applying to that apparatus for sure.
You just mentioned something that I think I skipped over when we were talking about the aerial design itself, and that is short jacking. You want to get in a little bit to jack spread and short jacking?
Yeah. There's usually two ways of manufacturers are going to get away or design an apparatus in the short jack fashion. And basically they either allow the truck to short jack, or what they'll typically have is some sort of model within their fleet of a very small jack spread. And that would be, if a manufacturer is selling you on, hey, we don't need a short jack because our jack spread's so minimal, there's a benefit there. Every rig that I personally have been on, we've been able to short jack. Again, I work in a very tight city. We border the north end of downtown Orlando, so very kind of urban with some suburban areas. And we use our short jack feature very often, dealing with parallel parked cars and all that. So there's value there. Now, as an operator, not only a driver operator, not only when you approach the scene, are you looking for where your tip's positioning, where your outriggers where your turntable is positioned, but also where your outriggers are. And you have to project your path of travel for those outriggers to avoid things like cars or manhole covers or drains and all those things. And so there's a lot of things to look at when you're positioning that rig. I'm a big fan of rigs that have the ability to short jack, but I'm also a big fan if the manufacturer has a apparatus in their fleet that has a very short jack spread.
So something I'll mention, that a product that we offer at FRC, 360 camera systems have become much more popular in the industry, especially on an aerial device. When they first came out on aerial devices, they were difficult because it was 4 cameras, one on the front, one on the rear, one on each side. Well, that aerial device is really long. And ideally, you want that middle camera up fairly high to give yourself more vision. That's not usually possible because you've got an aerial device and you don't have really tall compartments. We now have a 6-camera system so that you can get 2 cameras on each side. It spreads out, it stitches everything together. And then the one feature that I don't think has gotten enough attention that is really cool, in my opinion, is our Outrigger system. So you can have that 360 camera give you an image that looks like your Outriggers. And that way, when you're pulling up on scene, you talked about it, Eric, a good experienced driver, he's looking in that mirror and he's going, okay, I think I'm in between them 2 cars. I can get my jack out, but he's making a judgment call. And he's really trying to peer down there and see that. With this overlay system, you would hit a button, you can physically see the car, and you see this red line that is the outline of your jack. And if it's over the bumper of the car, I can't put it in service there. But if I move up a little, it'll get in between. It's a pretty cool system that can help out.
Yeah, we just had a recent class about a month ago, and a couple of the rigs had that a very similar software system. And so the students in their final day, when they were responding in and spotting and trying to make rescues of their fellow students off this building, I had quite a few of them tell me that that was a very handy feature to have on their apparatus.
Yeah, so jumping back here, let's go operationally. So departments considering between the bucket versus the ladder, what's sort of the things you're telling them to consider, maybe the big things they got to look at right away?
Yeah, I'm always a fan of thinking of a ladder as your egress and access apparatus. I mean, that is, climbing in and out of the building, just really quick, easy to set up. I mean, typically they're much quicker to set up. Again, you can pierce them through a tree if you have a low tree canopy, and it's just a nice, easy transition in and out of that ladder tip to your building, whether you get on a balcony, a roof, or through a window. Your platform is nice because you can basically elevate all your gear and equipment up to a certain location and step off and get to work. They're going to be a little slower to set up. Obviously, it's a bigger footprint. So, again, thinking about the tree canopy, that may be a little difficult. Or if you're working around a lot of wires and things like that, that could be a little bit difficult. Your tip loads are going to be bigger on on a bucket truck. So if you're again carrying a lot of equipment and gear, think about that. The water, if you're kind of more set on, I want to design an aero device with water kind of to the forefront of my mind, I would strongly suggest a platform, a bucket truck. I mean, those things, again, you can put that water in a lot of different places and a lot of funky areas, and it flows a ton of water. And so, those things are great for water application. If you want a safe working platform for your people, let's say you're doing some exterior overhaul or something like that, where you want two firefighters in there pulling siding, cutting out of a bucket. If you're on a pitched roof and you don't want to commit people to a roof, a bucket truck's much easier to do that from, much safer to do that from. But again, I just, sticks are just quick to set up, easy to fit through tight spaces, get on and off them. If you're rescuing people, this is kind of a big debate here. People they assume buckets are the more premier rescuing civilians and bringing them down. Just realize if you're going to put a civilian in a bucket and you're going to fly them down, you now had to have positioned for a spot to land the bucket, because you might not take a 90-year-old person, get them in a bucket, bed the ladder, and expect them to walk down these turntable steps. So they may need a help getting down to the ground. So you have to accompany for that. And then if you've ever made the transition, if you're operating at a very high level in a bucket truck, that knuckle of the bucket, that's a very kind of sketchy transition to transition out of that bucket onto the climbing ladder if you're working with like an aerial tower and being able to climb down. Whereas an aerial, you put it right where you want it. A continuous walking up and down that ladder assists people up and down that ladder. You can also fly people down. If you avoid the pinch points, you can put them at the tip of the ladder, and we've ladder belt people in and laid them on the ground as well. So
there's two features and options that we see in buckets at times. One is a spray nozzle off the bottom. So that's pretty simple. I can use it if I'm doing a decon corridor. I can use it just if I'm operating and there could be some potential flame impingement underneath. I can turn on that sprayer to protect the bucket. The other one, though, that I question at times is a discharge up there. And the purpose of the discharge would be to hook a hose line up and extend it across the roof. Do you have any experience using anything like that?
just through training, because we're not, that's way down the list for our priority. If we're going to use that for engine company operations, we much prefer to build our own vertical standpipe, whether it be, a coupling drop or some sort of rope stretch to bring a line up to us. I'm definitely not a fan of putting them on the tip of aerial devices. Bucket trucks, sure, if you want to go that route. I would argue if you're running a stack tip, I would exit that feature and just, pop your stack tip and build your standpipe off of there. But aerial devices, what happens when you do that is it widens the footprint of that aerial device. And again, you've heard me speak a lot about the benefit of an aerial is being able to put it in tight spaces. And that becomes a huge issue, especially in our classes when we go to apartments, because again, a lot of suburban apartments, they put on all these added features thinking, hey, we just want to be able to do everything. We have to act as an engine or a ladder. And you'll see quickly in our drills why that's so negative. People on aerial devices get so sucked in that they have to put the aerial 90 degrees straight along the building. And so all those features are off to the side. And as soon as we position them where they're going to work off the side, they realize now that standpipe connection, that 2.5 discharge, has now put a 1.5 foot of space between their ladder and the building, creating a little bit of a gap where they have to make access to the building. And then also we've had drills where they've wanted to use that standpipe. They position off to the side. Well, the standpipe connection was actually on the opposite side of the ladder to the building. So they had to actually climb out of the window, get on the ladder, make the connection, and pull the hose back into the building, right? Not efficient, not doesn't make sense. And again, if you're going to do that, we would advise just running it off the stack tip if you're going to do that. Realize too, it is a standpipe. So that's inline gauge, that's your gate valve, all that system needs to come up with you, and you have to have an operator there. Ideally, you have an operator there working that control valve, and just as you would in a standpipe equipped building. Again, not a big fan of that. I think there's other ways around it than tying up the only aerial, and could potentially the only aerial device on that scene where it could be used. We could get a mayday, and then all of a sudden now we need a stick or a platform up to the floor where the mayday is happening to bring a firefighter down, or maybe we find a victim, or maybe the fire spreads and now we need defensive operations and we have this hose line connected. Now, I will tell you, a local department in our area just north of here, one of the big colleges in Florida, they had a fire in their stadium. And so the stadium has multiple gates to get to the actual stadium, all the ticket booths and things like that. And this was one use of the ladder I thought was pretty clever. And they actually stretched the ladder over all those ticket booths and ran their single line connection off of there. So they basically kind of brought a horizontal standpipe, if you think of it like that, and ran their line off there. I thought that was pretty clever in that case. But again, you can just unscrew the appropriate stack tip and run it from that point.
Absolutely. Great points. I think we probably say this too much on our podcast. We're not telling you that you've done anything right or wrong. It's your design. It's your apparatus. We're just giving you things to think about. And those are some great points on why you might not want to do something like that, because we tend to overcomplicate things a lot. Mm-hmm. I've got one more thing, and you talked about junking that tip up and putting way too much stuff up there. Another thing that's near and dear to our heart is lighting. And the thing that usually gets me is when someone says, well, I want the brightest light you have, and I want to stick it out in the tip of my aerial device. And I kind of looked and said, so are you just trying to replace a Wilbur Tower with $1 million aerial device? Or are you trying to blind your guys that are on the roof doing some work? Talk about what you've seen and what you think should be out there.
Yeah. All I'm going to say this: if you're going to put lights on there, the lighting technology now, there's no excuse to not have a small light. If you can have one or two, but very small is sucked into, especially think of an aerial device, is sucked in close to those upright rails as possible. To keep that tip nice and small. Again, people are building multi-million-dollar light towers. They kind of prioritize, again, all these added features when we kind of got, me personally, I think we need to strip away a lot of that stuff and all that mindset and think about, hey, what's the priority here to have an aerial device? If it's rescue or access and egress, then we should design the apparatus with that in mind first. And then if we get into, okay, do we want to do a 2.5 discharge? Do we want to do a light package? Look at adding those things, but making sure that they're an optimal model of light for this case to fit still the need that's going to benefit us in the rescue and access part. So the other thing is the brightness of that light. Just as you said, you're blinding the members on say operating on a roof. How that light cuts through smoke or does not cut through smoke, how it reflects off smoke. You're going to have to play with different hues and lighting power to figure out what works best for you all. But the easiest thing to do, and the one thing I would always recommend, is get a small light package as possible if you're going to put some nice lights up there. And with the technology today, you should have no excuse not to do that.
Options are abundant, and
Yeah,
I think you hit it. Don't just go with what you've always done. Explore what's out there.
absolutely.
Yeah, so as we wrap up the show, we always like to kind of summarize all the insights and tips that you've given. So, two questions here, and we'll start with the first one. Give us the three biggest things that you need to consider when it comes to the rear versus the mid mount.
Yeah, rear versus mid mount. I'm going to say three things to consider would be compartment space. Remember, rear mount is going to be more, mid mount's going to be less. Response model. So how all your apparatus in your fleet respond to an alarm. If you're choking up the front of your building with engines, you might want to go with that mid mount. So that way that turntable is pushed a little closer to the scene. And then opposite there, if you ran a rear mount in that case, that's going to be pushed farther down the block. And then another thing I would consider would be ride height, just because that was one of the things that shot to our priority just based off our city. Being that we have a low tree canopy, you may have a department that has a low bridge in the area. With that rear mount, you're going to have higher ride height. With the mid mounts, you're going to have a little lower ride height.
Three biggest things to consider between the ladder versus the bucket.
Yep. Bucket versus ladder, three things would be tip load. Again, typically your tip load on a bucket is going to be much higher than an aerial device. If you're going to lean towards wanting a device that is more about water application, I would strongly look into a bucket truck. They're going to be more premier for that, but mean that they can flow more GPM. You can put the water and water map in way more different areas than you could a ladder. And then also I would look into, again, leaning towards, how congested your areas are. I would consider an aerial device if you're in a tight spot. If you want not only tight with aerial and all that, but typically the number of jacks and the jack spreads are going to be a little bit smaller and condensed with an aerial device, being that it's a lighter weight vehicle. And then if you kind of have more open space, via a tree canopy or open space as far as people and traffic, you could look into a platform in that case.
Yeah, I think a lot of great stuff today, Eric. And again, appreciate your time for coming on and a lot of insights and tips. And like we talked about, I think we like to do a good job of the podcast of giving you different people's experiences and what people can take from that. And everyone does it just a little bit differently. But in our experience, Jason, everyone has sort of said similar things, right? You got to know your district, you got to know what the purpose of that apparatus is for, and then you got to look at when you take something, you're going to give something, and vice versa. So, Eric, thanks again for your time, and Jason, I'll open it up to you for any final comments.
Again, Eric, thank you for the insight. We appreciate you coming on. We appreciate you giving your opinion on things. I know sometimes people will judge them for their opinion. We appreciate you being open about it. I'm going to leave with a funny story that you made me think of when you started this. So when we started the conversation about mid mount and rear mount, you brought up something, parking unseen. So if I've got a department that likes to pull that pumper out front and block the aerial, and now I've got a rear mount, I'm further away. I won't name the department again, but it's a big department in this country, a top city. When I was doing apparatus design for them years ago, I noticed they had no crosslays. They had everything came off the rear of the pumper. And I asked the chief at one point, I said, why no crosslays? Why? I mean, it's not uncommon, but it's fairly unique to not have any crosslays at all. And he said, well, we could not teach our drivers to pull past. So we took it away from them. So he said, we won't let them stop and put the crosslay right at the door. They know they got to pull past because the pre-connect comes off the rear and now my aerial can get in. So it was a unique way to solve a problem.
Yeah, and I have a big grin on my face because although you're not talking about my department,
No.
that is exactly what we did. We went all off the rear, and so we talk a lot about engine spec and what that has to do with the truck company, how that affects the truck company, and that forces the drivers now to pull past, usually cab away from the building. They have a cleaner stretch. The officer get three sides, and now our truck company, who again mentioned it was a tiller truck, so it is a mid-mount, is able to get that turntable and that apparatus right at the front of the building, and we very well did that exactly the way you just said that.
That is funny because I was not at all talking about your department, not even in your state.
Yeah, well, we're definitely not the most well-known or the largest department in the state. We're quite opposite of that, or in the country. So,
Well, great stuff today. And again, Eric, thanks for your time. So this has been another episode of Rig Recon Live. Again, if you haven't already, you can follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook. That's at Rig Recon. You can catch this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. A full season 1 and season 2 is here, and we're already starting to work on season 3. So here to stay. And most importantly, visit our website, rigrecon.com, for all the latest apparatus information, including product comparisons, comparison charts, FAQ videos, how-to videos, and all of the above. But until then, spec the best.